Nero's mother, Agrippina, likely enjoyed the greatest moment of her life on the day her son Nero was inaugurated as Rome's 5th emperor. She had murdered so many people, including members of her own family, to get to this moment. And there he was, her little boy, now 17 years old, raised to the purple. The Praetorian Guard took Nero's money and would therefore support him. Senators had every expectation of being invited back into the emperor's inner circle, and so they too were enthusiastic about the change in leadership. And so with Nero, it appeared that the lessons of recent history had been learned. No one was going to take down this golden emperor. Of course, they forgot one person, Nero himself. How did Nero's marvelous beginning descend into a symbolic and literal suicide? We'll talk about that on these next few episodes of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 18, Nero, the Making of a Bad Emperor. Before we get started, I'd just like to thank those of you that are listening to the show. It's been amazing to see how quickly folks have latched onto the show. Obviously, people are listening and then telling their friends. And right now, really, this is a word-of-mouth podcast. So I'm very grateful for your support. One thing you can do for the show, in addition to letting other people know about it, is you can give the show a rating. Whatever podcast app you're using, Spotify, Apple Podcast, etc., there'll be a place where you can give the show a rating. And if you do that, it just helps bump the show up in the search engine results. So please, if you would, give the show a rating, especially if you like the show. And thank you so much for your continued support. Let's get on with today's episode. In the year AD 54, Nero begun his reign. And he did so really in all the right ways. He sent all the right signals to all the right people. The previous emperor, Claudius, Nero's adopted father, had practically shut out the Senate and instead had surrounded himself with women and former slaves to be his advisors. But one of Nero's first acts was to purge the imperial court that had grown up around Claudius, and he exiled and executed many of those slaves and former slaves and other hangers-on that the Senate had deemed unworthy advisors. And Nero made substantive legal changes along these same lines, putting forward laws that curbed the power of wealthy former slaves. He banned the children of former slaves from holding any political office or joining the Senate, and he also instituted a severe inheritance tax of over 80% on the estates of freedmen. Members of the Senate had for some time felt threatened by the rise of a new class of very wealthy freedmen. These were former slaves of rich Romans, and they had used the connections and the financial and entrepreneurial skills they had gained while serving as household slaves to rapidly enrich themselves when they became free, spending so much time with senators and equestrians and other rich Romans had given these former slaves a ready-made social network that they could immediately use. And so Nero's new restrictions on freedmen elated these senators, who didn't like all the new money going to people that were outside their elite class. Through measures like these, Nero was declaring that his rule would be one which upheld the interests of the Senate. And so Rome's nobles were in fact so happy with this that they passed a law to begin the new year on December the 1st. This was Nero's birthday. But the new emperor politely refused. And that too, of course, was a good sign. It suggested that there was some humility in Nero. But also, Nero was willing to delegate. He was only 17 after all, and he seemed to understand that. Again, another good sign. For his chief advisor, he appointed a man who was likely responsible for many of his best policies. This was the senator and Stoic philosopher Seneca, who we met in the last episode. Nero's chief military strategist and head of security was the praetorian prefect that was recently appointed by his mother. And as for his mother, Agrippina, she too was going to get a significant role in the new administration. Now, it couldn't be formal, but the biographer Suetonius, who was actually born the year that Nero died, records that Agrippina was given, quote, management of all public and private business. And again, Romans can't overtly have a woman ruling, so what Nero does is he gives Agrippina a new title. That title was Best of Mothers. And I wonder if Nero put that one on a coffee mug for her. In effect, she was his regent, and he was to be her Pinocchio. At least initially, Nero was a focal point for an alliance between members of the Senate, Agrippina, and the Praetorian Guard. But this alliance was fragile. Nero soon realized, probably through his advisor Seneca, that if he wanted to be more like Augustus and less like Claudius, he needed to reduce the influence of freedmen and also women in his court. Agrippina, therefore, was due for a demotion. The first sign that she was going to have reduced status in the new regime was that Nero began to ignore her advice. And this was in small ways. So Nero would associate with people, for example, that his mother didn't approve of. The chief of these was actually a woman, a low-status former slave named Acte. Nero was married. He was a couple years, in fact, into the political marriage with his once legal sister, Claudius's daughter Octavia. But Acte had won Nero's heart, and so he spent quite a bit of time with her in those early years. Nero's advisor Seneca was happy with the affair. He thought it gave Nero an opportunity to sow his wild oats. After all, he had been married before he was even age 18. Agrippina, however, did not like this one bit. She thought she was at risk of being supplanted. And this is what Tacitus says about that. Quote, Agrippina, just like a woman, grumbled about the freed woman rival, the serving girl daughter-in-law, and she would not wait until her son regretted or tired of the liaison. In fact, the fouler her reproaches, the more she fired his passion, until eventually he was driven by the power of his love to throw off all deference to his mother. That's Tacitus, Book 13. So the affair with Acte was effectively just a fling for Nero, but it allowed the emperor to exercise his independence from a mother who had been so overbearing. Agrippina was losing her grip on Nero. And one day, this normally calculating, calm woman just lost it with her son. Among the insults and accusations that she hurled at Nero was a thinly veiled threat that maybe Claudius's 13-year-old son Britannicus would make a more compliant emperor. Now, Agrippina probably never intended half of what she said during that tirade, including that jab at Nero's position. She was, of course, bluffing. If Britannicus were made emperor, would he really just let his father's murderer live? Of course not. But Agrippina couldn't take back her words, and Nero would remember them. One night, not long after Agrippina's temper tantrum, Nero called his mother's bluff. It was a night not unlike the one on which Claudius ate the tainted mushrooms that sent him to the realm of the gods. We have the details in Tacitus's account. Nero dined with his brother Britannicus at one table. Agrippina and Octavia were also in the room. Britannicus's drink was tasted for poison without problem. This was a normal thing for all members of the imperial family. They had their food and drink tasted for poison. So Nero's drink passed muster. But whatever was in the cup, we don't know what liquid it was boiling hot. And so it was sent quickly back to the kitchen just for a moment to add a little bit of cold water. So after it was cooled, Britannicus got his cup back and he drank deeply. And as the family continued eating, Britannicus had found that he had lost his voice. And then he began struggling to breathe and eventually collapsed on the floor. No one moved a muscle. Everyone just stared at Nero, who was reclining back in his chair, as though nothing significant happened. Agrippina and Octavia and everyone else in the room stared in utter shock. It was obvious to everyone present that there was one person there who knew what was going to happen, and it was Nero who had planned that poisoning. He had ordered Britannicus's drink prepared too hot on purpose, and his agent in the kitchen then slipped the toxic ingredient in the cooling water, and this bypassed the poison taster, and Britannicus was dead. Tacitus even tells us that Nero had the funeral arrangements already made ahead of time. So the festivities paused, and the imperial family held a brief, informal funeral for Britannicus before the feast was resumed. But one of the dining couches remained conspicuously empty. That night would be one to remember. Suddenly, the emperor that everybody had seen as a helpless mama's boy was revealed as both a man and a monster. Agrippina had taught Nero better than she had realized, and Nero was just getting started. Agrippina at this point seems to have panicked, and that's at least what the sources suggest. She went from being conniving and controlling quite suddenly to being permissive and passive. Instead of forbidding the liaisons with Acti, she offered Nero her own chambers. And while Nero was busy, Agrippina started getting close to Octavia, possibly to gain influence with her as an indirect way to regain influence with her son. At the same time, she began courting important, wealthy, and powerful senators, giving them large gifts, perhaps searching for a new man to control. But over time, Nero deserted his mother altogether and moved her out of the imperial palace. He would only visit her with armed guards. All of Rome came to learn that Agrippina was persona non grata, and even her closest friends began to keep their distance. Tacitus tells us that Agrippina then became so desperate to regain Nero's favor that she may have even attempted to seduce her own son. Now, most historians think these claims in the sources are untrue. I certainly am not convinced, and even the sources in which these rumors appear seem to question them. The story probably just serves to point out just how desperate Agrippina had become. And then one day, probably in the year 58 AD, but perhaps as late as 59, Nero got a wild idea. He was watching a performance, and in this play or drama or whatever it was, we don't know, there was a prop boat that was designed on purpose as part of the show to just collapse. It was one of the most sophisticated special effects that anybody in the ancient world had seen. But Nero saw something more than just a trick. And so several months later, Agrippina was out on the sea in a brand new boat. Inexplicably, the deck caved in. Agrippina would have been crushed or drowned then and there, but one of the couches that was under the deck blocked the mechanism from fully opening, and the ship ended up sinking quite slowly, such that Agrippina was able to move away from the wreckage, probably on some flotsam, and survive. One of her maids actually reached the shore first and called out that she was Agrippina, and she was doing this, of course, in the hopes that she would get a quicker rescue. She was probably pretty tired. And coincidentally enough, some of Nero's men just so happened to be on the shore. Thinking that this maid was Agrippina, they went out to meet her and clubbed her to death. And Agrippina may have seen, or at least heard, all of this. She did not come into shore. She stayed out at sea over the course of an entire night. Quite an incredible woman. Eventually, a fisherman found her, and after she identified herself, the fisherman took her back to her villa at Naples. Probably before she even dried off, Agrippina had realized that this was no accident. It was a matter of time before Nero was going to try to kill her again. A lesser woman would have fled, but Agrippina was proud. She had made Nero, not the other way around. She was not going to cower. And so she sent a message to her son. Her ship had been sunk, due to an unforeseen accident, but she was just fine. When the messenger arrived at the imperial palace, Nero realized that his plot had failed. And so he resorted to something far more simple. A dagger was planted on the messenger that Agrippina sent, and Nero claimed that the man was really an assassin sent to kill him, and his mother was the planner. Agrippina, after all, had a reputation for murder, and she also had quite a few enemies at this point. And so, in short order, Nero's soldiers surrounded Agrippina at her palace, moved into her bedroom, and Tacitus tells us what happened next. Quote, "The assassin stood around the bed, and the captain took the lead, striking her on the head with a club. The centurion then drew his sword to deliver the death blow. 'Strike me in the belly,' she cried, thrusting out to them her womb, and was finished off by a welter of stab wounds." That's Tacitus in his Annals. Agrippina offered the assassins the womb from which sprang the boy who ordered her death, her own son. It was a noble end for a woman that both ancient Romans and modern historians have loved to hate. Agrippina never commanded legions, but she commanded the men who did, first Claudius and then her son Nero. She not only deftly wielded power, but she did so through proxies. And she did this on a scale that few women, or men for that matter, in history would ever replicate. And so now Nero, with his mother dead, immediately took to bashing and blaming Agrippina. Tacitus tells us some of what Nero said, that Agrippina had sought to rule the empire, and even bind praetorians and senators, and even the whole population, with a loyalty oath to her personally. Nero said that she had opposed the emperor's spending money on the people and the soldiers, and that ultimately, quote, her extermination was for the public good. That's again Tacitus. And I think there's no doubt Agrippina did wish to rule, and certainly left behind a high body count in more ways than one, but she was also a crucial figure in Nero's government. And without her, as we'll see in the following episodes, Nero's reign took a massive nosedive. Britain revolted. Nero's debauchery intensified, and a great fire reduced whole neighborhoods in Rome to dust and ashes. With Agrippina dead, Nero had to find new scapegoats for these calamities, and he did, in a new group of religious fanatics that had just recently established residency in Rome. These, of course, were the Christians, and they still, to this day, remember Nero's persecution. The story continues next week on the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.